On the morning of April 18th, 2026, a dust-colored sedan that was too clean for the county roads pulled into the long gravel drive of Emmett's farm. A young woman got out, holding a digital recorder in one hand and a notepad in the other. She walked with the hesitant, careful steps of someone unaccustomed to the uneven ground of a working farmyard. She was looking for a legend, though the legend was nothing more than a piece of agricultural equipment, an assembly of steel and welds parked under the deep eaves of the main barn. To the people who now sought it out on the internet, in niche forums dedicated to sustainable agriculture and durable goods, it was known as the Survivor Plow. To everyone in this faded grain elevator town on the American Great Plains, for the better part of 2 decades, it had just been Emmett's folly. The young woman found Emmett's grandson, Caleb, cleaning the very same plow. He was a man now, with his grandfather's quiet eyes and his father's solid build. He looked up and gave a slow nod, already knowing why she was there. She was the third one that spring. First a blogger from the city, then a professor of rural sociology, and now her, a graduate student from the State Agricultural University. They all came with the same reverent curiosity, as if they were visiting a shrine. They came to document a thing that, by every modern metric, should not exist. A tool built by hand from scrap, in a world of computer-designed, factory-stamped, and finance-driven machinery. A tool that had outlasted every single one of its gleaming, green and yellow contemporaries sold in the county. A tool whose creation had been the subject of open, public ridicule. She asked her questions, and Caleb answered them in the patient, understated tones he had learned from the old man himself. He pointed out the different pieces of steel, reciting their origins like a family history. The main beam, dark and massive, had been a structural I-beam from the old Cargill elevator torn down in '98. The coulter, the sharp wheel that sliced the earth ahead of the share, was forged from the leaf spring of a Studebaker truck that had been rusting in a shelter belt since the Eisenhower administration. And the share itself, the critical cutting edge that did the hardest work, was a shaped and hardened piece of railroad track, its steel imbued with the memory of 1,000,000 tons of freight. As she took her notes, her face a mixture of academic fascination and genuine awe, it was clear she was documenting more than just a plow. She was documenting an idea, an artifact from a different timeline, a timeline where things were made to last, not to be replaced. To understand why her visit mattered, why this ungainly, unpainted assembly of metal had become an object of pilgrimage, you have to understand the world that dismissed it. You have to go back 20 years to a cold winter, a broken machine, and a decision that set an old man against the relentless, sensible, and deeply fragile logic of his time. The story really began in the winter of 2005. The snows came early and stayed late, a thick white blanket that buried the flat, dryland wheat country under a profound silence. In his workshop, the air thick with the scent of cold iron and damp concrete, Emmett stared at the fractured frame of his Massey Ferguson moldboard plow. It was the third time it had failed in the same place, a weak point in the casting just behind the hitch. He had welded it twice before, but this time the metal was too fatigued, too crystalline. The brake was tired, a final admission of defeat. It was done. His son, Dale, stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the cold and his own rising frustration. Dale was a practical man, a man who believed in balance sheets and warranties. He saw the farm not as a legacy, but as a business, and a business needed reliable equipment. "That's it, Dad. We can't patch it again. We'll lose a week of planting time trying to fix it, and we'll still be worrying about it every time we hit a rock." Grant over at the Deere dealership has a 3710 on the lot. 5 bottoms, hydraulic reset. We can get financing at 2%. It's the only sensible thing to do. Emmett ran a gloved hand over the cold, dead steel of the broken plow. He didn't look at his son. He was listening to the metal, and it had nothing more to say. He had bought this plow used, and it had given him 10 years of service, which was 7 more than it was probably designed for. He knew its weaknesses, had learned to work around them, but its time was over. Yet the thought of replacing it with a new one felt like a different kind of failure. "We don't need a 3710, Emmett said, his voice quiet but firm. "What do you mean we don't need it?" Dale's voice rose. "We need a plow. We're running 1,000 acres of winter wheat. We can't turn that soil with a shovel. This isn't a hobby." "I know what it is," Emmett replied, finally turning to face him. "I also know what that new plow is. It's a down payment on the next one. The steel in them is thin, Dale. It's engineered to a price. The bearings are sealed units. When they go, you replace the whole hub. The frame is designed to be just strong enough. It's not built to last. It's built to be replaced. Buying it doesn't solve a problem. It just subscribes us to a new one." Dale shook his head, a gesture of pure exasperation. He had heard this lecture his entire life. The old ways, the old materials, the old wisdom. To him it sounded like an excuse to avoid spending money, a stubborn pride that was becoming a liability. "So what's your plan?" Dale asked, his tone sharp with disbelief. "Let the fields go fallow? Hope a plow falls out of the sky?" Emmett looked past his son, out the open workshop door towards the sprawling scrap pile that bordered the windbreak of Siberian elms. To Dale, it was a junkyard, an eyesore, a collection of rusting metal that the county was constantly threatening to fine them over. But to Emmett, it was a library. It was an inventory. "I'll build one," he said. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. Dale stared at his father as if he'd announced he was going to build a rocket ship. The idea was absurd, archaic, insane. Nobody built their own implements anymore. It was the 21st century. You bought things, you financed them, you traded them in. You didn't waste an entire winter trying to reinvent a tool that had been perfected and mass-produced 100 miles away. "You'll build one," Dale repeated, the words flat, without a question mark. It was a statement of defeat. He saw the look in his father's eyes, the quiet, unshakable resolve that had defined the man his entire life. There would be no arguing. "You'll be the laughingstock of the county, Dad. Maybe," Emmett said, turning back to his workbench. "But the ground won't know the difference." The decision was made. Dale left, the stiff set of his shoulders a clear signal of his disapproval. He was worried about the planting season, about the banknote, about the neighbors' sideways glances. He loved his father, but he could not understand him. He saw a foolish old man clinging to a world that no longer existed, a world where a man's hands were more valuable than his line of credit. Emmett, alone in his shop, felt not the sting of his son's doubt, but the familiar, clarifying quiet that came after a necessary decision. He was isolated, but he was not lost. He knew exactly where he was going. He was going to the scrap pile. Let me tell you about the iron, because it's where the story really begins. The modern world sees scrap as an ending. It is the final state of a consumed product, its value reduced to weight, its identity erased. For Emmett, it was the opposite. His scrap pile was a collection of beginnings, a catalogue of materials whose stories were not yet over. He was not a hoarder, he was a curator of industrial memory. He had learned this from his own father, a man who had survived the Depression with a forge and a deep understanding of metal's character. His father had taught him that steel was not a single, uniform thing. Every piece was different, shaped by its history. A piece of factory new mild steel was a blank slate, an innocent. It knew nothing of the world. But a piece of old steel, steel that had lived a life, carried wisdom in its crystalline structure. It had been stressed, heated, cooled, and worn. It had a biography. The I-beam from the old grain elevator, for example, had spent 70 years in compression, holding up the weight of 1,000,000 bushels of wheat. It was made of good, honest, simple steel from an era before metallurgists learned how to shave microscopic pennies off the cost by adding more carbon and less manganese. It was overbuilt, designed with a margin of safety that was now considered inefficient. It knew how to be a backbone. It would not twist. The leaf spring from the old Studebaker was a masterpiece of resilience. For decades, it had absorbed the shocks of rutted farm roads, flexing thousands of times a day without complaint. Its high silicon steel had been heat-treated to create a hard surface and a soft core, a combination that gave it an almost living ability to bend and return, to give without breaking. It knew the physics of surprise, it understood the nature of impact, and the section of railroad track was something else entirely. It was a monument to endurance, forged to withstand the immense, percussive and abrasive force of steel wheels carrying loaded hopper cars. Its surface was work-hardened to a state of incredible density. It had spent its life being ground down, yet it had barely worn. It knew how to face abrasion and win. It was patient, implacable steel. This was Emmett's philosophy. He believed you didn't choose steel based on a specification sheet printed in a lab. You chose it based on its lived experience. He was building a plow, and a plow is a tool that lives a life of constant, brutal struggle against the earth. He needed a backbone that wouldn't twist, a shock absorber that wouldn't break, and a cutting edge that wouldn't wear. The world saw a pile of rust. He saw a team of specialists. The modern view, embodied by Grant down at the John Deere dealership, was the polar opposite. For Grant, steel was a line item on a bill of materials. It was sourced from the lowest bidder that met a minimum engineering specification. Its value was in its uniformity, its predictability in a mass production environment. A plowshare was not a unique object with a history. It was a part number, SKU 77B 401 Tyne, one of 10,000 stamped from the same sheet. Heat treated in the same computer-controlled oven. Its biography was irrelevant. Its only purpose was to perform within its warranty period and then be replaced. The idea of a plowshare made from railroad track was, to Grant, comical. It was inefficient. How could you scale that? How could you put that on a spreadsheet? Emmett's approach was a direct affront to this entire system. It was slow. It was labor-intensive. It yielded a single, unique object that could never be perfectly replicated. It was, in the language of Dale's business school textbooks, a profoundly unscalable solution. It was a liability. To Emmett, this was its greatest strength. He wasn't building a product. He was building a partner. And that winter, in the quiet cold of his workshop, the partnership began to take shape. The work was a slow, deliberate ritual that unfolded over 4 months of biting wind and drifting snow. It began with fire. Emmett fired up his old forge, a behemoth of brick and cast iron that had been in his family for 3 generations. The rhythmic wheeze of the hand-cranked bellows filled the shop, a sound like a sleeping giant breathing. He laid the Studebaker leaf spring in the glowing coals, watching it, waiting for the precise color, the shade of bright cherry red that told him the steel was ready to move. He worked not with haste, but with a deep, methodical patience. Using tongs, he pulled the glowing spring from the fire and laid it on the anvil. The first hammer blows were not to shape it, but to straighten it, to erase its old memory of being a spring so he could give it a new one. The ring of the hammer on the hot steel was the only sound in the world, a clear, sharp note that echoed off the corrugated iron walls. Sparks flew in the dim light, brief, incandescent constellations. He worked the steel, turning it, striking it, coaxing it from a curve into a straight, flat bar. Then, back into the fire and out again, this time to forge the curve and the edge of the coulter, the cutting wheel. This was a conversation, a negotiation between his will and the steel's nature. He could not force it into a shape it did not want to take. He had to persuade it. His grandson, Caleb, was 10 years old that winter. He would often wander into the workshop after school, drawn by the fire and the rhythmic clang of the hammer. He would stand in the corner, a safe distance from the sparks, his face lit by the orange glow of the forge. He was both fascinated and faintly embarrassed. His friends' grandfathers watched television or went to coffee at the grain co-op. His was in a cold shed, hitting rusty metal with a hammer. "Why are you doing that, Grandpa?" he asked one afternoon. "Dad says you can just buy a new one." Emmett didn't stop his work. He slid the cooling metal into a slack tub, and a furious hiss of steam erupted, filling the air with a clean mineral smell. He looked at the boy. "Your father is right," Emmett said. "You can buy one. But this one will be ours. When you buy something, you're just renting it. The company that made it, they still own a piece of it. They own the parts. They own the repairs. When you build it yourself, you own all of it. Every piece, every problem, and every solution." Caleb didn't understand. The logic of ownership was less compelling than the logic of the schoolyard, where shiny and new were the only things that mattered. He saw the unpainted, mismatched pieces of his grandfather's project and compared them to the sleek green machines in the brochures Dale left on the kitchen table. He felt a pang of shame for the old, the handmade, the ugly. The work continued. Emmett cut the I-beam to length with an oxyacetylene torch, the hiss and pop of the flame a violent counterpoint to the patient rhythm of the forge. He spent a week fabricating the frogs and standards, the complex brackets that would hold the plow bottoms to the main beam. He used a drill press that was older than he was, its heavy cast iron frame absorbing all vibration, allowing him to drill perfectly true holes. He didn't measure with lasers or digital calipers. He used soapstone and a steel rule, trusting his eye and his hand. The most difficult part was the plowshare, the cutting edge made from the railroad track. The steel was so hard it resisted the hacksaw and laughed at the drill bits. He had to heat it in the forge and use a hot cut hardy on the anvil to slowly, painstakingly shape it. He spent days grinding the edge, first with a coarse stone wheel that threw a shower of brilliant white sparks, then with finer grits, until he had an edge that was not just sharp, but polished, a mirror of hardened steel. As the days grew longer and the snow began to melt, revealing the dark, damp earth, the plow was nearly complete. It was an object of brutalist functionality. It had no paint, no decals, no plastic shrouds. Its beauty was in its honesty. You could see the thick, caterpillar-like pattern of the welds. You could see the different textures and colors of the various steels he had used. It did not look like a machine. It looked like a sculpture of pure intention. It was heavy, overbuilt, and completely devoid of the slick aesthetics of modern manufacturing. It was ready. In early March of 2006, the town's social and commercial life revolved around the annual pre-season Ag Expo, held at the sprawling county fairgrounds. It was a place for farmers to see the latest equipment, kick tires, and talk to dealers before the earnest work of spring began. Grant, the owner of the local John Deere franchise, had the largest and most prominent display, a vast tent filled with gleaming tractors and implements, their iconic green and yellow paint catching the weak spring sun. Dale, in a last-ditch effort to bring his father back into the fold of modern sense, had an idea. He thought if Emmett could see his creation next to the real thing, the professional machines, he might realize the folly of his project. Or, perhaps, if he brought the plow to the expo, someone might even buy it. And he could use the money for a down payment on a real plow. He framed it to Emmett as a matter of pride. "You spent all winter on it, Dad. You should show it off. Let people see what you made." Emmett knew his son's motives, but he agreed. He was not ashamed of his work. So they loaded the heavy, unpainted plow onto the flatbed truck and drove it to the fairgrounds. They found an empty spot at the edge of the exhibition area, far from the polished concrete floors of the main tents. The plow sat on the muddy ground, looking ancient and out of place, a relic from another age. It didn't take long for Grant to notice it. Grant was in his element at the expo. He was young, confident, and a true believer in the products he sold. He wore a crisp, embroidered green shirt and moved with the easy authority of a man who held the keys to progress. He saw Emmett's plow and saw an opportunity for some sport. He ambled over, a small crowd of farmers and salesmen trailing in his wake. He circled the plow slowly, a smirk playing on his lips. He ran a hand over one of Emmett's thick, utilitarian welds. He tapped the massive I-beam with his knuckles. "Well now, what have we got here?" he said, his voice loud enough for the whole group to hear. He turned to the crowd, a performer playing to his audience. "Somebody's been cleaning out their scrap pile. Who in the world built this thing?" The crowd chuckled. Dale, standing by the truck, felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. He wished the ground would open up and swallow him. He looked at his father, who stood calmly beside his creation, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Emmett raised a hand. "I did." Grant's smile widened. He had his straight man. "You did, huh? Well, Emmett, you've got a lot of steel here. What's it made of?" "Steel," Emmett said, his voice flat. Right, steel," Grant said, laughing. "But what kind?" "We use 1080 high-carbon boron steel in our new plowshares. Heat-treated, computer-tested for stress tolerance." "What's this one here made of?" He pointed to the polished, formidable edge of the railroad track share. Emmett looked at the plowshare, then back at Grant. "The kind that remembers," he said. A few people in the crowd laughed outright. The statement was so absurd, so nonsensical in their world of metallurgical data and performance analytics. Grant seized on it. "Remembers what?" "How to be a train track. Emmett, this is impressive as a folk art project. But we're talking about turning 1,000 acres here. We're talking about efficiency, fuel economy, soil penetration dynamics. This thing," he gestured to the plow, "this is a museum piece." He put a friendly hand on Emmett's shoulder, his voice dropping into a confidential, salesman's tone. "Tell you what, I admire the effort. I'll give you a fair trade-in on it. We'll call it 500 for scrap, and I'll knock another 1,000 off a new 3710. We can have it delivered to your place tomorrow." It was a public act of dismissal, framed as generosity. Grant was offering to erase the mistake, to absorb the folly back into the sensible system of commerce. The crowd murmured its approval. It was a good deal. It was a way out for the old man. Emmett didn't move. He looked from Grant's smiling face to the plow he had spent a winter building. He thought of the fire and the hammer, the slow shaping of purpose from discarded things. He looked at the gleaming, perfect, and soulless machines in Grant's tent. "This one isn't for sale," he said quietly, but with a finality that cut through the noise. "And it isn't for breaking." He turned, and without another word, began to winch the plow back onto the flatbed. The crowd grew quiet, unsure what to make of the old man's refusal. The joke had fallen flat. Dale, his face grim, helped his father secure the chains. The laughter had died, replaced by a confused pity. As they drove away from the fairgrounds, the silence in the truck was as heavy as the plow on the bed behind them. The confrontation was over, and in the eyes of everyone there, the system had won. The crisis that vindicated Emmett's folly was not a single, dramatic event. It was a slow, grinding 20-year war of attrition against the realities of farming on the Great Plains. The enemy was not a storm or a blight, but the very nature of the soil and the hidden costs of manufactured efficiency. The first skirmish came in the spring of 2009. Emmett's neighbor, a man named Frank, who had been in the crowd that day at the expo, had bought the floor model 3710 that Grant had offered Emmett. Frank was plowing a field that bordered Emmett's land, a field known for its buried glacial till. He hit a large, submerged rock. The 37 tons hydraulic reset was supposed to trip, allowing the plow bottom to swing back and over the obstruction. But the impact was too sharp, too direct. There was a sickening crack that echoed across the prairie. The main frame, A complex piece of cast steel had snapped clean in two. The flaw was microscopic, a weakness in the casting, but the result was catastrophic. Frank lost 5 crucial days of planting time, waiting for a new frame to be shipped from a factory 1,000 miles away. The warranty covered the part, but it didn't cover the lost time, the fuel, or the quiet erosion of faith in the machine. A week later, Emmett was plowing the adjacent field. Caleb, now a teenager driving the grain truck, watched from the road. He saw the tractor lurch as the plow hit something hard. There was a loud, metallic shriek. The whole machine shuddered. But it did not stop. The Studebaker leaf spring, serving as the coulter's shank, flexed under the immense shock, absorbing the impact in a way a rigid piece of cast steel never could. The railroad track share scraped a long white scar on the rock and moved on. The plow had met the unyielding earth, and it had yielded just enough to survive. Dale, who saw it happen from the other end of the field, said nothing, but he remembered the sound of Frank's plow breaking. By 2013, the war had moved to a different front: consumables. Grant's dealership was now selling the 4820 series. The new plows were lighter, designed to be pulled faster by more powerful tractors. To save weight, the steel was thinner, but the real innovation was in the parts business. The new plowshares, made from a proprietary alloy, were incredibly sharp, but wore down with astonishing speed in the abrasive, silica-rich soil of the plains. Farmers found themselves replacing shares twice a season, at a cost of several $100s per bottom. It was a brilliant business model, turning a durable good into a subscription service. That fall, Emmett pulled his plow into the workshop for its annual maintenance. The share was dull, but its mass was barely diminished. He heated the cutting edge in the forge, hammered it back to a sharp profile, and then hardened it again in the quench tank. The entire process took 3 hours. He had done it every year for 7 years. The steel, born of the railroad, seemed to have no limit to its patience. It remembered how to endure. Dale watched him work, did the math on what his neighbors were spending on replacement parts, and the deep certainty of the modern world began to feel a little less certain. The turning point came during the multi-year drought that began in 2017. The sun baked the land, turning the rich loam into something resembling red brick. Plowing became a form of mechanical torture. The ground was so hard, it fought back with a vengeance. That was the year the frames began to fail. Not just the newer, lighter models, but even the older, heavier ones. The constant high-frequency vibration and the sudden, violent impacts were more than they were designed to handle. 2 of Dale's friends had to have their main plow beams welded. Another bought a brand-new plow, only to see its hitch assembly develop stress cracks in the first 100 acres. The machines, designed in a lab for an idealized version of farming, were being broken by the stubborn reality of the land itself. Emmett's plow, however, seemed to thrive on the abuse. The massive I-beam backbone didn't flex or vibrate. The heavy, overbuilt standards held the bottoms steady. The plowshares, designed for the friction of 1,000,000 tons of rolling steel, cut through the baked earth as if it were just another job. Dale, who was now running most of the farm's operations, found himself treating the old plow with a new respect. It was no longer his father's embarrassing art project. It was their most reliable asset. It was the only tool they owned that did not seem to be afraid of the land. The skeptical apprentice was finally fully converted. He stopped suggesting they upgrade. He started asking his father to teach him how to weld. By 2024, Grant had long since sold his dealership to a national agribusiness conglomerate and retired to a warmer state. The personal connection, the handshake deals, were gone, replaced by corporate service plans and centralized parts distribution. The new plows were technological marvels, guided by GPS to within an inch of accuracy. Their every function monitored by sensors and reported to an iPad in the cab. But the steel they were made of was a ghost of what it had been. They were platforms for technology, not tools of the earth. They were designed for the managed, predictable fields of corporate agriculture, not the cantankerous, history-rich soil of a family farm. They were, in a word, brittle. And so, on that April morning in 2026, when the young woman from the university arrived, the climax of the story was already 20 years in the making. It wasn't a sudden victory. It was a quiet, undeniable fact, proven over 2 decades of relentless work. The plow that had been laughed out of the Ag Expo was the only one of its class and vintage still turning soil in the entire county. The sleek, perfect machines it had been mocked by were now rusting in the very scrap piles Emmett had once harvested. Their warranties expired, their parts discontinued, their brief, efficient lives over. Caleb, a man now, finished cleaning the plowshare and looked at the student. Grandpa always said it wasn't about building something that was unbreakable, he told her, his voice echoing the quiet wisdom of the old man. It was about building something that knew how to survive being broken. Everything on this was designed to be fixed, right here, in that shop, with a forge and a welder. Not replaced. The vindication wasn't loud. It wasn't a triumphant "I told you so." It was the quiet hum of the online article being shared among farmers in other states. It was the respectful silence in the local coffee shop when Emmett's name came up. It was the simple, profound truth of a tool that had endured, a tool that had kept a family on their land. The laughter of that day in 2006 had long since faded, forgotten by most who were there. But the plow remained. It remembered everything. The student's article, published in a small but respected journal on agricultural sustainability, was titled "The Plow That Remembers." It didn't go viral in the conventional sense, but it found its way to the people who needed to read it. It circulated on farming forums, was printed out and tacked to the bulletin boards of rural co-ops, and was discussed in quiet tones by farmers who were tired of the tyranny of the new. They were tired of the cycle of debt, the planned obsolescence, the feeling that they no longer owned their own equipment, but were merely leasing it from distant corporations. A slow trickle of visitors began to arrive at the farm. They were farmers from neighboring counties, even neighboring states. They didn't come to buy plows. They came to learn. They would find Emmett, now well into his 80s but still clear-eyed, and ask him about the steel, about the forge, about how to see the potential in a piece of scrap. The workshop, once a place of solitary, misunderstood labor, became an informal school. Emmett, who had never sought to be a teacher, found himself passing on the knowledge his father had given him. He taught them how to read the story of a piece of metal, how to heat it, how to shape it, how to give it a new purpose. The true inheritor of the legacy was Caleb. He had absorbed his grandfather's philosophy not as a set of rules, but as a way of seeing the world. He now ran the farm, but his real passion was in the workshop. He wasn't just maintaining the old plow, he was applying its principles to other problems. He was building a heavy-duty cultivator from the frame of an old truck and the tines from salvaged hayrake teeth. He understood that this was not about nostalgia or rejecting technology. It was about resilience. It was about independence. One evening, as the sun set over the wheat fields, Dale found his father watching Caleb work in the shop, the sparks from a grinder lighting up the twilight. Dale had made his peace with his father's decision years ago, but he had never said the words. He stood next to the old man, and for a long time, they just watched the boy work. "You were right," Dale said, his voice quiet. "All those years ago, you were right. I was looking at the monthly payment on the loan. I was looking at the price. You were looking at the value. I never understood the difference until now." Emmett placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "The price is what you pay," he said. "The value is what you keep." The story of Emmett's plow is not really about a plow. It is a parable about two opposing worldviews. The first is the worldview of the system, represented by Grant and his dealership. It is a world of data, efficiency, and scale. It measures success in quarterly reports, market share, and the rapid, predictable cycle of replacement. It sees raw materials as commodities and finished goods as disposable assets. Its logic is clean, compelling, and built on the assumption of a stable, predictable world. But its strength, its uniformity, its reliance on a complex global supply chain, its optimization for a single set of conditions, is also its fatal weakness. It is a brittle system. When faced with the unexpected, the abrasive, the truly difficult, it breaks. The second is the worldview of Emmett and his workshop. It is a world of character, resilience, and patience. It measures success in decades, in the ability to endure, in the knowledge passed down through hands. It sees materials as having a history and a future. It believes that the solution to a problem should be as durable as the problem itself. Its logic is messy, inefficient, and deeply personal. It cannot be scaled. It cannot be optimized for a spreadsheet. But it is rooted in the specific realities of a place and its challenges. It knows how to bend without breaking. It knows how to be repaired. It is a resilient system. One worldview sells you a product designed to fail. The other teaches you how to create a tool designed to endure. One is the path of the consumer, forever dependent on the system. The other is the path of the craftsman, sovereign in his own small world.